Like Chris mentioned, my name is Alex Worsfold. I've been with CATI for about 8 years now, and I am a certified SOLIDWORKS expert with a focus on the CAD side and the visualization side. So today we're going to be talking about SOLIDWORKS Visualize Professional and how you can bring your designs to life. Now, of course, there's lots of different aspects to SOLIDWORKS. We've got the design side. We can simulate things. We can also build for sustainability and manage that project. However, today we're going to be talking about how to communicate your design ideas with SOLIDWORKS Visualize Professional. So what I've got going on here is a rendering that I created a little while back. If you guys were with us for a webinar a few weeks ago, I showed this assembly, and we talked about the surfacing aspect of SOLIDWORKS. Today we're going to talk about how do we get these kinds of renderings out of Visualize Professional. So in this case, we're showing an animation, showing a camera moving around and maybe even how to move the model around. But today we're going to go through this from start to finish. So like I said, we're going to talk about how this model is set up in SOLIDWORKS as far as the appearances and cameras go. We'll also talk about how to add lights and adjust the environment, ambient lighting. We'll talk about how to control the camera and how to move things around and what comes across from SOLIDWORKS when we import this into Visualize. We'll talk about how to animate the model and the cameras, and with that, any other aspects to Visualize we can also animate. And then once we're finished setting up the scene, cameras, and lighting, we'll talk about how to finally output this to all the different wonderful formats that Visualize brings to the table. So let's talk about scene and model setup. And we're going to jump back into SOLIDWORKS to do this. So inside of SOLIDWORKS here, you can see that most of my components already have a top-level appearance already applied, like this orange color. Some of the other components have a black color. But if we switch over to the Appearance tab, we can see that not only are parts applied with colors, but we could have surface bodies, solid bodies, faces, features, all that information could be applied. And when it's time to render, we simply just need to turn on Visualize from the add-ins. Once Visualize is turned on, you'll see that there's a new tab here that shows up inside of SOLIDWORKS. We're just going to click this Export Simple button. And by doing that, SOLIDWORKS gathers up all of the part models, all of our appearances, all of the bodies, and it's going to group those together into a logical fashion inside of Visualize Professional. And within just a few seconds there, a couple of minutes maybe, and actually not even a minute, probably less than a minute, we have our geometry all ready to go. So once this is brought into Visualize, you see there the model is already brought in. And if we take a look at the Model tab, so underneath this root, we can see that all of the bodies have been applied with the appearance name. And if we look at the Appearance tab, all of our appearances from SOLIDWORKS came across. If we look at the Scene tab, we see our environment that came from SOLIDWORKS, along with the backplate and the default lighting from SOLIDWORKS, as well as the cameras. Now, a couple of these appearances are intentionally left undefined. So like these headlights here, for example. I want to apply some textures to this. So I wanted to show you guys how this can be done inside of Visualize. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to hide this outer layer, this outer lens. So there's another layer on the inside that I want to apply some texture to. So once we've done that, I'm going to go over here to my library, and I want to grab this window appearance and apply it to the headlight. Now, once I've applied that, I also want to change the bumping or the texture that is presented on the back side of this lens. So I'm going to do that by adding a bump map. Now, these are some textures that I found out on the web. I'm just going to use this headlight normal map here. And applying this, there's a lot of different things that we can adjust here. So one of those being the tile. I notice this is backwards, so I can just flip this direction here. We can also adjust the bump strength. So if I wanted the ridges to have more intensity to them, I can increase or decrease that strength as needed. I also want to adjust a couple of the appearance settings here. So I want to treat this as a solid face because we're really only applying this to the surface. I'm going to change my index of refraction there a little bit and my color density so that everything is nice and clear. And then I can drag and drop that appearance over to the second light to apply the same texture to the other side. Now the fog light here is a little bit different. We've got kind of an orange appearance on the front, and then on the inside we're going to use another window glass appearance. Now I don't want it to be the same as the headlights, so we'll go ahead and drag another instance of that appearance in, and you can see that we've got now two instances that I can adjust separately. We'll go ahead and apply this fog light normal map here. And then again, we'll go ahead and adjust the bump strength and the texture placement. So there we go. Again, using the same index of refraction earlier, and we're going to change that color density so it's nice and clear. I want to show those other parts for the lenses, so the front surface, so we get that nice kind of glossy texture on the outside of the lens. And then let's go ahead and preview this to see what it looks like. So I'm switching from the preview mode to the accurate mode. This is where the actual ray tracing comes in. So now it's actually bouncing light around in the scene and bringing that back to the camera. And we can kind of see exactly what my rendering is going to turn out to be. So here what I'm adjusting, I noticed that the fog light looks a little bit orange here. So I want to adjust the color to this. So switching again back to the appearance, finding that brown glass material, I can start to play with these hues and colors in real time. So I'm just kind of slide this over to the yellow side a little bit more. Of course, I can move that box around as well, or I can slide the value or the saturation. So that looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and use that. Kind of zooming in here, you can see the effect of the bump matte texture kind of disperses the light around on the inside of the headlight, giving it a very realistic looking feel. I'm going to switch back to preview mode here. It makes it much easier to apply textures and other appearance properties. And right now I'm just applying other materials, and I've sped up this part of the video here so that you guys can kind of see what it takes to define some of this stuff. So things like the tires, increasing the refraction there, the roughness value. And then once I'm finished, some of the materials I changed or removed, so I'm just tidying things up. And the next thing I want to do is apply a decal. So for the decal, I want to use the CATI logo. So we're going to use a transparent PNG for this. So once I've created my decal, I need to choose where I want to place it. This is done just simply by drag and drop. So if I drop it onto any surface of my model, it places it in there. And then using these handles, we can simply scale that or reposition. So we're going to kind of put it in this lower left-hand corner. Now, one thing you'll notice, the decal actually goes all the way through this model. So we would actually see a mirror image of that decal on the back side of the glass. Now in the preview mode, it appears that the decal is only surface thick. But if we go to the final render quality here and kind of zoom back into that decal, we're going to see that we actually see the decal presented on the back side of the glass too, along with the reflection of the shadow as well. So we want to adjust that a little bit. I only want my decal on the front side of the glass, or on the, in this case, the back of the car of the glass. So if we go to the mapping section here, there's an option for decal depth. So I can adjust that. It looks like that's not quite enough. So I'll go ahead and increase that a little bit more. So I'm just going to increase it by a factor of 10. And looks like that was too much. So some of the decal is being cut off there. So let's split the difference here. And looks like some of the decal is still going to the back side of that surface. So I'll split the difference one more time. And there we go. So now the decal is only going to be presented on the outer edge of the glass. And again, quick preview here to kind of see what it would look like when it was finished rendering. And that looks great. We've got a nice shadow of the decal on the inside edge of the glass, and it's reflecting exactly as it should. All right. So again, setting up your model first in SOLIDWORKS is going to be very beneficial to helping you set up and use those appearances in Visualize. Breaking them down into groups related to appearance will help you set that up quickly inside of Visualize. And then once you've brought that model into SOLIDWORKS or into Visualize, you can further refine that by adding more textures or even decals. Next, let's take a look at how to add lights. So back here in SOLIDWORKS, we're still looking at the same model. I'm sorry, in SOLIDWORKS Visualize. We're going to go ahead and get rid of these default lights that come from SOLIDWORKS. I'm also going to get rid of the backplate. And all we're looking at here is just the environment. So this environment actually provides most of the ambient light within the scene. And decreasing that to 0, you can see that there's 0 light otherwise. So we can adjust this ambient light. We have some libraries here of other light types. So one of these is a studio environment. This is one of my favorite environments. It's very nice soft light going on overhead with one soft light off to the side. Also, my model is not quite positioned properly here, so I've switched back to the model tabs so that I can adjust the rotation a little bit here. Kind of get the back end a little higher, and then we can move that model down to the floor as well. So I'm just kind of place it on the floor there. And that looks pretty good. Now I noticed on the side of the car here that my lighting is a little bit dark. So we can adjust that by adding an additional light. Or we can adjust the scene here. So one way we can do that is maybe by adjusting the gamma. So if I want to lower the intensity of those lights and bring up the intensity of the background, we could do that. Or we can increase the overall ambient brightness of the scene. So that's not too bad there. We can also add other floor effects like reflection and roughness to the floor. So if I want a little bit of a glossy effect on the floor, we could add that. We can also increase the intensity of the shadow. You can see the checkbox for that there and the value as well. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to change the color of the background here. I don't want to see the background in my scenes. I just want a nice white background. So this is going to be great for a nice isolated product shot. But again, the side of my car here is a little bit dark. So I'm going to add another light. I can do this just by simply clicking on a surface of the model. So I right click, add a light, pick the point where I want the light to hit, and SOLIDWORKS calculates where that lighting needs to sit. We can also adjust the color of that light. So we can do that either by hue. Of course, we can change saturation values as well. But we can also adjust the overall temperature of the lighting. So if we wanted a little bit of a warmer feel, we can lower that K value. And if we ever need to reposition this light, I can simply just right-click on the light and pick another target. All right. So the environment is really designed to bring most of your ambient lighting into the scene, and that could be something from like an outdoor scene or a studio. And then if you need additional lights to light up certain details about the model, you can add lights. Now the one that we added there was just a plane, just a flat plane, but that could be a sphere or a point. It could be a round disc or a tube, and you can add specific directionals or spotlights. Spotlights you could add basically a cone with some kind of light fall off at the outer edges. So lots of different options for lighting within Visualize Professional. So next, let's talk about controlling the camera. So now that we've got our lighting set up, there's a couple of extra things that we can define for our camera. Switch back to the preview mode, so make it a lot easier to set up. And again, we can see that the original camera views from SOLIDWORKS came across. I'm adjusting the aspect ratio, so there's lots of different categories and options for different sizes of renderings. So here I'm just using a 1920 by 1080. For the lens, we can adjust the focal length. So if we wanted a wide angle, we can go somewhere back to 25 millimeters, or if we wanted more of a telephoto lens, we can go up to 200 millimeters. And we can also simulate the iris effect or the f-stop of the camera. So we can adjust the focal distance, so where we're focusing at, and then anything in the foreground or background would be blurred out based on the f-stop or the aperture. We can also apply some post-processing effects here, either to the model or to the entire image. So we can apply a vignetting effect, so if we had some kind of a shade around the lens, we could simulate that. We can darken or lighten the image if the contrast was off too much. We can adjust the saturation, so if we wanted more of a stylized kind of image, we could adjust that. But the idea here is most of these settings are stuff that you would adjust post-rendering. So maybe in a tool like Photoshop or something like that, we might adjust these images afterwards. But here in Visualize Professional, we could do that all in one step. So not only can I render, I can adjust more subtle details as I'm creating my rendering. So I'll just adjust this to my liking here. So I'm going to bring the lighting back down a little bit and our exposure back to 1. And let's kind of play with the gamma a little bit here. Let's bring that down so we can have the colors come up a little bit more. So that's looking pretty good. Now I want to duplicate this. So I've got more cameras that I need to add. So to do this, I can just right-click on the camera, just adjusting some of the exposure still. All right, so now we can duplicate that camera, so I can right-click, and let SOLIDWORKS Visualize catch up. So there we go, there's a second image, second camera, and then I can reposition this camera, and it inherits all of the original settings and properties that the first one did. Of course, I'm going to readjust my depth of field for this specific camera, and then we'll duplicate it again. Again, selecting that camera, repositioning. So that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and add my focal point there. Duplicate that another time here. And maybe something in the front here, left quarter. And again, we'll go ahead and set the focal distance here. Again, we can duplicate this, and it looks like I misclicked there. So we'll go ahead and make this one the side instead. And then we'll make another camera for the rear. Again, once I've got that in position, we'll go ahead and set the focal distance one last time. And let's capture the logo there. All right, so that's looking pretty good. We'll do one last camera at the rear. And set our focal point. Now I can also rename these cameras. So we'll make this the main view. Let's do the close front here. I'll make this one just the front view. Let's make this one the left side view. We'll make this one the close rear. And then the rear view. Now, other types of cameras that we can create, there are, right now this one is set to orthographic. We can set this as a perspective view, which is what all of our other cameras are set up. But we can also do a spherical 360-degree camera. So I'm going to reposition my camera inside the car here so we can get a nice shot from inside the model. And then I'll switch my type to 360. So this is going to lay out flat 360-degree views all the way around the model. So this is a 360-degree panoramic view. Now we can simulate stereo views as well. So if we had those nice red and blue glasses, we could simulate that. Or if we wanted to simulate with VR, we can do that as well. We can also preview what the panorama is going to look like. So this allows me to, keep the camera focal point in one spot and then kind of look around the model and see, how my lighting and scene is set up here. Again, this is only a preview, so that's why it looks pretty pixelated here. But we'd be able to render this camera out as well and get an interactive image shot that we could put on the web for internal views like this. All right, so we talked about controlling the different aspects of the camera. Of course, we can do orthographic views just like normal flat views inside of SOLIDWORKS, as well as perspective images to give us that nice vanishing point kind of feel. We can also create 360-degree views for panoramas or for use with inside of VR. We can adjust things like depth of field and motion blur with our lenses, different filters for some pre-post processing effects. We can embed that into the rendering as it's created, so it kind of shortens the amount of time that would be needed to touch up these photos afterwards, and motion blur for creating animations. Speaking of animations, let's talk about how to do that as well. So again, back here in Visualize Professional, now that we've got all these cameras, we want to set up maybe a product rotational shot. So we can go down here to the timeline, and one option would be to add a rotation animation. So if we go here to animation, there's an option for adding a rotation animation. Of course, you can adjust where this is pivoting, but the default is just around the y-axis, and that pivot point was already centered on my model. So it makes it a snap to go ahead and create a rotational product shot. Let's back up here. I actually want to get a little bit more stylized with this. So we're going to create our own cameras. So I'm going to start a new camera here, and we'll call this for a movement. So we'll call this movement 1, let's say. And because I might want to set up several different movements here, we'll go ahead and set our camera lens angle, and then we'll start to position this camera where we want to start. Once we've got this in the starting position, I'm going to add a keyframe. So it adds that point to the timeline down here. Now, if I want to add another point, I just move my timeline, move the camera, and you can see it adds another keyframe there. I can move these key points throughout the timeline. So if I want to adjust the duration of my camera movement, I can do that. So you can see just a simple movement from point A to point B. So let's go ahead and reposition a little bit here. So my final position, we wanted to end looking head on at the car, and then starting, we'll kind of readjust our starting position. And now if I play that back, you see that it automatically updates those keyframes depending on where my position is on the timeline. Now we can also duplicate these spots. So for example, if we change the duration of our animation, I can right-click on one of these keyframes and duplicate it, and then drag it to a different point on the timeline. So that starting position is now going to be remembered. So I can kind of simulate going from point A to point B to point A again. We can also control different aspects about these key points. So if I double-click on my timeline here, and I'm just going to drag up this area. There we go. And if I click on this keyframe here, we can see that I've got different transitional options here. So one of those being linear. So the default is to just kind of ramp in smoothly up to that point. But if I wanted more of a, just a straight move to this point and then move again, there's not going to be any kind of acceleration from that point. So it changes the way that the camera ramps as its movement goes. Now, I'll go ahead and add several other cameras here, so I'm just going to speed up this part of the video. And so I'm going to add a camera view that slides across the front of the car here. We'll add another camera view that kind of rotates around to the rear end. So starting from about here, move to the end point, move the camera again, and then we've got those endpoint transitions set up. So there we go. Now the final piece of the puzzle here is I added some depth of field. So you see some extra little points there along the timeline. So those points are where the depth of field and focal point is changing as the camera moves. And then you can see here I'm just going in between each camera movement so you guys can see where each camera is going from and to along the timeline. All right, so with the animation tools inside of Visualize Professional, it makes it very easy to create rotational animations of individual components. So if we wanted to simulate tires moving and rotating, or maybe even just the whole assembly rotating, it's very easy to add a rotation animation to any one of those parts. And of course, anything inside of Visualize can be keyframed. So you could adjust things like material color, material texture, lighting position, lighting color, lots of different things that could be keyframed with the animation tools inside of Visualize Pro. So lastly, let's talk about the outputs. How do we get all of these renderings done? So let's go ahead and minimize that timeline, and we want to export our main camera view here. So up on the top toolbar here, we can start to render. Lots of different image formats that we can use. I'm going to use a JPEG. We can also render out all cameras, configurations, panoramics, or interactive images all at one step here. I'm just going to render each one of these individually so you guys can see. There's also an option in Visualize Pro for render output passes. That's helpful if you need to do any kind of post-processing inside of Photoshop. If you needed to do some compositing, that will allow you to do that very easily. And then here I'm going to adjust the number of passes for the render. So Visualize will never stop rendering. You need to tell it the quality that you want to end up with. So in this case, we want it a pretty high quality. So we're going to change this up to 300. And with the denoiser, it increases the number of passes by about a factor of 10. So denoiser is an AI process on the video card. It accelerates that process. I set that image to the render queue, so it's not actually rendering yet. I'm kind of queuing these up so that we'll be able to render them in the future. So I'm just going to send each one of these cameras and got the rear view here. We'll go ahead and export this one as well. And then we want to also export our animations. So for these, we've got another tab here. So we can switch to the animation tab. And just as before, we've got different formats. So we're going to use the MP4 format. And then we can also adjust how each frame is rendered. So the size and the quality for each frame. Now, because this is an animation, it's going to take quite a bit longer for each frame. You know, we've got about 5 seconds or 4 seconds of video for each one of these cameras at about 30 frames a second. It's a lot of frames to render. So we're going to lower the quality down to about 100 there. And there you can see in the queue that that camera has been added. So we'll do that for the rest of these cameras. I forgot the main view up here, so we'll go ahead and send that one as well. And then we'll come back down to movement 4 and export this one as well. And then also for movement 5. So there we go. If we take a look at the queue again, you can see that everything is set up and ready to go. And you know, this is something that would be done maybe closer to the end of the day, because my computer is going to have to sit here and render out these images. So we can go back into Visualize. We'll go ahead and close our project and save it. And then when we're ready to head home for the day, we'll go ahead and start that render process. And I wanted to show you guys about how long this stuff takes to render. So remember, these images we're rendering about 300 passes. So on my machine, this is about a 4 gigahertz machine. So those renderings at 1080p are taking about 6 to 7 minutes to complete each one of those images. And they're pretty complex in terms of, you know, post-processing that's going on. We've got some focal effects that are going on. So that's a pretty good render time. 5 minutes is pretty quick, especially for a fully 1080p image. Now, of course, the animations themselves are going to take quite a bit longer to render. Those were taking about 3 hours or so to complete. So here's the results of those images. And I had them in here again. So these are full quality. And then this is the result of the animation. Now, of course, I had to take each one of those rendered clips, if you would call them, and I used a video editing application to put these together and add the transition between each one. But that's super simple to do after the fact. So again, final outputs, we can create interactive images, output passes for each image. So if you wanted to show just the shadow or just the reflection pass, you can do that in those output passes with Visualize Pro. Of course, we can do interactive images. I don't have an example of that today, but that's also an option for export. And then full quality options on the animations for the output. And then don't forget the render queue. So you can queue all of this stuff up so that you're not wasting any time watching the computer render. You can let this do the rendering after hours once you leave for the day. And we've hit all of our 5 points today. And so Chris, did you want to talk about the upcoming webinars here?
Sure, I am more than happy to discuss them. Thank you so much for all that fantastic information, Alex. So as you can see up on the screen, everyone, kind of looking at the next month and a half or so, we've got our CATIpult session on just how to get started with sheet metal. Very, very basic sheet metal overview. Our hardware webcast will cover some new functionality with the Creaform scanners. We know that everybody builds assemblies, so we've got a nice webcast coming up on maybe a couple of shortcuts one could use in that assembly space. And the last one there, talking about the SOLIDWORKS Express tools, such as Simulation Express or Flow Express. There's a whole bunch of these simple-to-use, kind of basic analysis type tools in SOLIDWORKS, and we're going to cover a bunch of those. The last thing I will mention here is be on the lookout for emails for our Design Innovation Summits in October. Those are going to be our rollout events. So we're going to have some really great content through the entire month of October with webcasts, as well as, of course, all the live events to show some of the really cool new functionality that's coming out. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Really appreciate your attendance. There you can see some awesome contact information. Yeah, if you need any additional information, send us an email, give us a call. We are always here to help. So with that said, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.